Hi there, welcome to Canyons Church Online. It's no accident that you're here today, and we believe God has something special for you. Our heart is to create a space where you can grow in your faith, find encouragement, and connect with others, even if it's online. Feel free to grab your coffee, settle in, and take this time to focus on what God has for you. And if you have a question or need prayer, we're just a click away. Thanks for being part of our online family. Let's jump in.
In August of 2010, I moved from the United States to South Korea. Now, I know it's a military town, so a lot of you guys have moved across the world on numerous occasions. Being like in the church world, I know a lot of missionaries who have had to pack up everything and move to different parts of the globe. In those cases, a lot of times, either the government is sending your stuff or you get a shipping container out of Long Beach and you get to send it. Well, when I went to teach English, all I got was my 2 checked bags that would max out at 50 pounds, plus a carry-on and a personal item. And so here's what happens as I'm flying into Seoul Incheon Airport, and as I'm looking at my tickets, I noticed that it's like a different airport code between like my flight to Korea and my flight to my final destination of Busan, which is like the distance between LA and San Francisco, okay? So I'm like, wait a second, this is a completely different airport. What am I going to do? So I look over to the guy next to me. He's also an American who's teaching overseas. And I'm like, any idea? He's like, oh yeah, follow me through customs, grab your bags. I'll show you how to get to your next flight. Well, what I didn't realize is that I should have just asked one of the airport employees, because what he was actually telling me to do was follow him to the train station, where I then have 150 minutes to try and race 30 miles from the international airport in Incheon to the domestic airport in Seoul. All the while, I've got my 175 pounds of all of my material possessions with me. Now, something else to understand about me in 2010 is knowing that I was leaving the United States, I decided to eat my goodbyes for about 3 months, okay? Like everybody that I wanted to say hi to, just knowing that, I was going to be gone for the next 12 to 24 months. So I'm going to lunch with this person and dinner with this person. So here I am, a little overweight, my 4 bags all around my neck, my shoulders. I'm rolling as well. And also you have to understand, South Korea in August is a very hot and humid place. So if you can picture this, little 24-year-old chubby me racing for 150 minutes, 30 miles. I am drenched in sweat. And the other side of it too is, not to stereotype, but like the Koreans in the East, and like East Asian people, they always look spectacular. They always look amazing. Like they're dressed incredible. They all look, just perfectly well kept. And here I am just sweating through my shirt with a panicked look on my face, not knowing if I'm going to make it in time. And here's what I've learned, and something that you all have probably experienced as well. The more baggage you carry, the more taxing things are, right? Like the more that you have in your hands, the more that you're trying to juggle, the more that you've got just trying to get from this place to the next, it's hard. It's hard to keep up with it. It's heavy. Now, today's sermon is based on a book by Levi Lesko called Swipe Right, The Life and Death Power of Sex and Romance. And today's sermon is entitled The Things That We Carry. Now, I read recently that 95% of people who wish to get married will do so before they reach 90 years old, which means if you're 80 in this room and you're like, man, I'm still holding out hope, there is honestly, I'm not kidding. There's still hope. So based on this statistic, it just makes sense that, me as your pastor, I should talk to you about this, because here's the thing. You want to get this right. Right? If you want to ever get married, if you ever want to find that special someone, if you are married and you want it to get better, you've got to get this right. Because more than likely, right, there's a 95% chance You're going to stand in front of a pastor or a civil servant and say, "Till death do us part." You want to get this right. Have you ever seen how expensive and hurtful a divorce can be? You want to get this right. Like, you don't want to find yourself on the short end of the stick. So here's the sad part. We often don't get this right. In fact, 50% of first marriages end in divorce. Now, you would think, all right, you've gone through a hurtful divorce, you've gone through a bad breakup, you probably learned some things and you're going to do better the next time, right? No, actually 67% of second marriages end in divorce. Now, third time's a charm, right? Once again, not really. 74% of third marriages end in divorce. Do you know why most of us probably avoid smoking besides like the cost of it? It's because we want to avoid lung cancer, right? But you know that according to studies, if you're an active smoker, you only have a 10 to 20% chance of contracting lung cancer because of smoking. A lot of you don't jump out of airplanes. And why don't you jump out of airplanes? Because you don't want to die. But you know you only have a 0.7% chance of dying while jumping out of an airplane? Like, what I'm saying is that we assess risks in almost all of these other areas. But what if I told you you have a 50% chance of going through one of the worst pains in your entire life just because you didn't approach finding a spouse the right way? That's what we need to talk about. We need to talk about the things that we carry into the process of looking for Mr. or Mrs. Right. So the very first thing that we carry is our expectations. So admit it, you probably have a list, right? Like when you were dating your now spouse, you probably had a list. Now, you might not have written it down, but you've got one. In fact, dating websites, they're kind of built around this. So to all of my card-carrying Democrats in the room, how many of you would be okay with meeting somebody at the coffee shop and they walk in with the big red "Make America Great Again" hat? Are you comfortable with that? Or are you okay? Hey, I'm going to let's just pretend that the other person is a vegan, and there's nothing wrong with veganism, but do you want to have the conversation every time you're going to go to a restaurant? Can we eat here or not? Right? Whether you've admitted it or not, you probably have a list. You might not have written it down, but you have thought through it. But if you reduce it down to its core elements, more than likely, your list come down to probably two things: chemistry and attraction. So what are you looking for in your soulmate? Are you looking for a sense of humor? Are you looking for them to be cultured? But let's be real, you probably get a little bit more specific than even that. You're like, you know what? I want them to be active. Wait, no, I want them to be so active that we can go on long backpack trips. They got to know Star Wars, right? That's one of the things. Or they got to like my weird hipster indie music from 2008. I don't know what your list actually is. So there's probably something in regards to chemistry that you're trying to assess. Are we a good fit? But let's talk about attraction. Okay, just strike that. We're not going to talk about attraction, all right? I think Freud would have some things to say about what you find attractive, but we're not going to do that right now. Here's what I'm saying, though. For too many people, their expectations that they are carrying into the search for a significant other is not making their lives easier. It's making them worse. For some of you, you have a list. You have hopes and dreams that are either making things way too restrictive or just way too loose. You're passing on some great people because they didn't know the Millennium Falcon can do the Kessel Run in 12 parsecs. Or for others, you'll throw away any standard that you could possibly have because, my goodness, they are just that hot, right? That's what a lot of us do. But here's another flaw in our system. You are constantly changing. They are constantly changing. The person that you are today is probably different than the person that you were 5 years ago. You are definitely a different person than the one you were 10 or 20 years ago. Your level of attractiveness has certainly shifted in the last 5 to 10 years. And what happens is a lot of times the things that we carry, the expectations that we carry into looking for a significant other is built on something that will most definitely shift over time. So is the solution to this just throw out all of your standards and say, you know what, there's no point in even trying? No. But what you have to do is you have to weigh your expectations correctly. You do need to have chemistry with your future spouse. You do need to be attracted to your future spouse. But I want you to add one more category to your list: integrity. Now, you're probably thinking that I mean like character, like do they lie or not? Yes, that's part of it, but that's not the entirety of it. What I mean when I say integrity is kind of like the integrity of a bridge, which means like, is it going to fall apart or not? Is the person that you are going to be attracted to, are they going to fall apart over time? Like I could spend hours walking you through a process to try and determine the integrity of a future spouse, but what I want to do is I want to give you a few different thoughts. I want to give you a few different questions to ask and consider what is the integrity of the other person. There's a book in the Old Testament by the name of Proverbs, and this is the absolute best picture of wisdom you can possibly find. In fact, I find it so important that whatever Bible plan I'm currently doing, I also make it a point to read through the Proverbs every single month. There's 31 chapters. I pick one a day, and I go through it 12 times a year. Why? Because I want to be a person who is wise. And so what I'm saying is this is an incredibly important topic. And what I would suggest is if you are looking for another person, if you are looking to be the right person, you want to be somebody who is wise. And if you were to read through the book of Proverbs, just, we won't go through the whole thing, but if you're just to read through it and start picking up on some themes, there's some pretty good questions you can ask. Like, of course, the easiest one is this person wise? Do they have a strong work ethic? Are they humble? How do they use their money? Are they duplicitous? What do they laugh at? Do they have self-control? Do they pick needless fights? The funny thing is that most of the time, when we're assessing whether we're a good fit with the other person, we don't look for any of those things. In fact, we ask these questions. Did they buy me gifts? Do they make my friends jealous? Right? Like these are the types of things that we ask. But I want you to picture this. It's 50 years from now. You're old, you're wrinkled, their six-pack has turned into a keg. Your knees are too weak to do those long runs on the beach. Is this the person you want to grow old with? What if their worst flaws got 50 to 100% worse? Is this the type of person that you'd want to grow old with? Whenever I do premarital counseling, we often spend a lot of time on two passages in particular. Let me read this one to you. This is 2 Corinthians 6, 14 through 15. It says, "Don't team up with those who are unbelievers. How can righteousness be a partner with wickedness? How can light live with darkness? What harmony can there be between Christ and the devil? How can a believer be a partner with an unbeliever?" So let me talk to the Christians in the room for a second. Because I know there's some people, you're here because you're seeking things out, you're looking, and you're free just to like daydream about, I don't know, the NBA All-Star game tonight, whatever you want to do. You can check out for the next 20 seconds. But let me talk to the Christians that are in the room for the second. When you're looking for somebody to spend your life with, you got to get this one right. What we're saying here is that the biblical principle is that you're going to have a completely different worldview than somebody who doesn't align themselves with Jesus. If you call yourself a follower of God, if you call yourself a Christian, man, there's going to be all sorts of issues if you invite somebody to spend the rest of your life with, if you can't see eye to eye on some of these fundamental differences. I guess what I'm saying is, if you're looking for a spouse, keep it in-house. Not like in the Mississippi kind of way, all right? Like, branch out from there. Sorry if anybody's from there. What I'm saying, though, is if you're a Christian and you're still looking to get married and you're assessing who is a good fit, one of the very first questions you should ask is this person also a follower of Jesus? Now, if you are married to somebody and they're not a follower of Jesus, you're stuck. We'll talk about that next week. But if you have the opportunity to look, this should be one of the first things. In fact, I want to take it even a step further, is that it's not just do they check the box of are they a Christian or not. There is also a question of like maturity. And so here's probably one of the best ways to describe this. If you are looking for a spouse and you are a Christian and you want to marry another Christian, here's what you want to do. Set your sights on Jesus. Run as fast as you can towards him, okay? Go as fast as you can towards Jesus. And then as you're running towards Jesus, look to the left and look to the right. If you see somebody else who's running just as fast as you, grab their hand as tight as you can and don't let them go, okay? That's what you want to do to try and find the person that you would actually be a good fit for. So Ephesians chapter 5 is the second passage that we spend a lot of time with. And this is a passage that's all about how do husbands and wives really live together? How do they spend their life together? But it's also a really good description of how do you assess the integrity of another person, of a potential spouse. And so we have to start with Ephesians 5:21, and I'll get to why in a second. It says, and further, submit to, next two words are very important, one another, out of reverence for Christ. So who is submitting here? Both of you. And the reason why this is so important is because if you skip over verse 21 and read verse 22 first, it's going to throw a lot of things out of balance. So the very first part is that you submit one to another, which leads into verse 22 that says, for wives, this means submit to your husbands as to the Lord. Now, if you completely forgot everything I just said, I know a lot of ladies are thinking right now, oh, here we go, right? And that's a righteous thought. Because for centuries, in fact, a lot of men have taken a verse like this and they've abused it, they've distorted it, and they've used it out of context to sit on almost a proverbial throne and just yell at the women in their lives to submit. Now, I've got a couple thoughts on this, okay? First of all, that's a wrong interpretation. The second is it does say here, wives submitting to husbands, not women submitting to men. This is not about a hierarchical, gender ranking thing. But the second is you can't understand verse 22 without looking at verse 21. And verse 21 submit to one another. So what I mean is this. Marriage should be a submission competition. And here's how this plays itself out. Marriages that work the best are when both parties are constantly asking the question, what's best for the other person? Right? That's the absolute best relationship you can be in is the one where they're both asking the question, what's best for her? What's best for him? And then submitting is saying, I trust that you have my best interests at heart. So if you don't do this, a marriage where two should become one should end up becoming a marriage for none because everybody's looking out for their own interests. So the question you want to ask when looking for a spouse, when it regards to their integrity, is can this person work in a team? Now it keeps going. It says in verse 25, for husbands, this means love your wives just as Christ loved the church. And here's the most important part. Because he describes how Jesus loved the church. He says he gave up his life for her. The leadership definition here is sacrificial service. So ladies, let's talk about this for a second. Is your boyfriend or the guy that you're considering spending your life with, is he willing to serve you? Or is he looking for mom 2.0? Right? He just wants you to wait on him hand and foot. I've learned that there's too many guys in relationships, they want to be Jesus in the sense that they want to be the God. But they don't want to be Jesus in the sense that they're willing to do whatever it takes for the health and the welfare and the protection and the provision of their wives, even if that means that they somehow suffer in the process. Leadership in a relationship is about providing. It's not about dictating. Now it keeps going. It says in verse 33, so again, I say each man must love his wife as he loves himself, and the wife must respect her husband. The concept here is if you want to find a spouse that has good integrity, That they not only are loving, because we just finished Valentine's Day. We're a culture that's obsessed with love, and often we can spot what's loving and what's not loving pretty easily. But we also want to be spouses who are respectful, which sometimes feels a little bit harder to put our fingers on. Because what does it mean to be respectful? Well, it means that even when they're not around, you speak well of them. You trust intuition. You trust that they're not an idiot. You believe the best in them, even when the evidence seems to suggest the contrary. To find somebody who is loving, even when you don't deserve it, stick to that person. Somebody who respects you, even when maybe you don't deserve it, stick with that person. This is what we mean when we say integrity. So the very first thing that we're carrying into our search for a significant other is just the baggage and the luggage of our expectations. But that's not the only thing. We also carry into our relationships the baggage of our regrets. I heard this story recently about a man who was in a car accident. In fact, he was in a car accident in 1963. He had just bought a brand new 63 Ford Thunderbird. And as he's driving during the rain, he gets onto some slick pavement and he starts to hydroplane and he crashes tragically into a semi. Now, the thing is, it was so horrific of an accident that the news actually shows up in the report on it, and they put out to their entire readership that nobody survived this accident. But here's the thing. The young man did survive. In fact, he had 5 broken ribs. He broke his hip. He had 50 different pieces of glass embedded in his body that they pulled out. And they put him into surgery. They put him in a full body cast, and he spends 8 weeks just laying in a hospital bed. But he ends up making a full recovery. So years and decades pass, and he finally is better, and he lives a pretty normal life. What was like a very painful memory becomes simply that, a memory. But one day, as he's going into the courthouse, he goes through the metal detector and it starts going off. So we've all been there. We know the drill. So you start you take off your belt, take off your watch, any rings you've got, you just put it aside. But he keeps going through, and it's just still beep, beep. So they pull out the wand, and they're doing the whole thing. And they get to his forearm, and it starts going crazy. So he rolls up his sleeve. It's still going crazy. He goes to the doctor. They take an x-ray, and they immediately do surgery. And wouldn't you know it, they find a 7-inch piece of metal buried in his forearm. It was news to him and everybody else. And this is a real story, by the way. I got a picture right here. It was the turn signal lever for a 1963 Ford Thunderbird. See, here's what's happening, is that there was so much that happened in this car accident. They pulled out so many other pieces, they missed it. They missed it. And it stayed inside of his body for over 50 years. And here's the lesson for all of us. Long after the impact is over, shrapnel remains. So the early church in Corinth was a very messy place. It was like Cancun during spring break with a side of Coachella served with a Vegas strip, okay? It was a very, very messy place. And so their pastor, Paul, says, guys, I need to give you some very practical advice, okay? Let's talk about real life issues that all of you are working through. The types of stuff where you wake up and you're already thinking about it because it's so practical to your life. So this is what he says in 1 Corinthians 6:16. And don't you realize that if a man joins himself to a prostitute, he becomes one body with her? For the scriptures say, the two are united into one. And when I say this is practical, I'm not saying this in jest. Apparently, this is a very real thing for the church in Corinth. That apparently, the guys would leave meeting with the church, and they would just swing by the local pagan temple, where temple prostitution was just part of a way of life. So they do communion with the church and then a little communal prostitution just, to close out the day. And here's what's really incredible about what Paul is saying. He could have said a lot of things for why they shouldn't do this. He could have said, don't you realize you're perpetuating a toxic culture where women are only seen for their bodies? It's true, but he didn't say that. He didn't say, don't you realize you can get a disease or an unwanted pregnancy? Also true, but that's not what he says. His one justification: when you have sex with someone else, your bodies become one. On a spiritual and an emotional level, you are fusing with the other person. We said this last week, and this is also the theme with this. Sex is more than just physical. But that's not what we say about sex. For my generation, we quote the Bloodhound Gang. You and me, baby, we ain't nothing but mammals, right? Like that's what we say. But I like what Pastor Andy Stanley says about this. He says, sex is a bit like glue. You shouldn't apply it until you're absolutely sure you're ready to stick two things together permanently. Do you guys remember Shark Week? Do you guys remember we used to all have cable and we watched Shark Week on the Discovery Channel? I like to live my life like what Tracy Jordan says, which we should live every week like it's Shark Week, right? Like it's incredible. So there's this one program called The Island of the Mega Shark. With just that title, I'm in, right? I'm in already. And it's all about great white sharks. And so you listen to the host of the show, the narrator, as well as the expert he's talking to. And the expert says, well, you can tell who the sexually mature females are based on the scars. And the narrator goes, what? He's like, well, you can tell whether it's a sexually mature female based on the scars. And so this, I don't know, maybe this is crass, I don't know. But what happens is the male sharks, they have to have something to hold on to while they're going. And so God had given the female sharks skin that's twice as thick as the males. And so the narrator, what he's trying to say is, like the expert, is, well, the scars over the female means sex. But what's true about sharks physically is also true about humans. We're not talking about fish anymore. A lot of times in this world, when we see scars, emotional or even spiritual sometimes, often sex is involved. I think about the kids who are facing the difficulty of the realization that somebody took advantage of them when they were innocent and young and could not stop it. In fact, the statistics are 1 out of 6 boys, 1 out of 4 girls have to endure the horror of molestation. Listen to this stat, and I think this is actually low. If there's one thing that the Me Too movement showed us, is that it's far more widespread than we realize. 11.9% of women have had the horror of forced intercourse. 20% of college co-eds experience some sort of sexual assault, but that's just when they're giving us the stats. What I'm saying is, scars often mean sex. And so what Paul is trying to say here in 1 Corinthians chapter 6 is, sex is more than just skin to skin. Sex is often much more spiritual and emotional than it is just physical, because two are becoming one. Now, there is often a physical cost too, right? I don't want to just give you a bunch of thou shalt nots and well, thus saith the Lord, here's what you should do. According to the World Health Organization, 28% of sexually active adults have herpes. 40% of college co-eds in the United States have HPV. And even if you somehow tiptoe through life without contracting anything or having some sort of physical symptom, there's still an impact on your heart and on your soul. According to, theologian, Chronicles of Narnia writer, C.S. Lewis, he wrote this about this. He says, the monstrosity of sexual intercourse outside of marriage is that those who indulge in it are trying to isolate one kind of union, the sexual, from all the other kinds of union which were intended to go along with it and make up the total union. Let's clarify a couple things. I've done talks like this a lot over the years. I used to be a college pastor, and this was it must be March because we're having this conversation again. And so, sometimes I'm kind of, I'd say caught off guard, but not so much anymore, by how many people would say I'm with Jesus 100%, but I really think that this view of sex is just so outdated, it's so backwards that nobody lives this way. In fact, if you read history, no one has ever lived this way. And the reality is there's some elements of truth to those statements. Now, the very first story of the Bible that we read about is God creating everything. And one of the things that we read about is God creating the first humans, Adam and Eve. And so what happens within the story is God says, you can eat of any tree in the garden with the exception of this one. If you eat this fruit, you're going to die. And then out of nowhere, a serpent shows up and says, nah, you won't die. Just try it. And so here's what happens. They eat it, and they don't die, at least not immediately. And this is actually a pretty good metaphor and a pretty good picture for what it sometimes feels like to get up here and say, like, hey, let's take these things seriously. God says we should wait. God says that we should do this the right way. And that little voice in the back of your head saying, now don't worry about it. Nothing bad's going to happen. And then you go through it and you follow through with the temptation. And you know what the reality is? Like, there's some benefits. Like, it is enjoyable. And in fact, like, God created sex to create intimacy and warmth. And even if you do it out of the right order, it still creates intimacy and warmth. Now, I'm still saying that I think that doing things out of order is wrong and sinful, but I think what I'm saying is I don't want to like mislead you by only saying, hey, it's absolutely wrong and absolutely sinful, and if you do it, you're going to die, and then you try it, and it's like, well, I didn't die. Because the reality is there is some fruit to it. Not good things. I'm just saying like fruit. Because like I said, God designed sex to be the most intimate act on the planet. It creates warmth and connection. And you're going to still see some benefits, some good things come out of even doing things out of order. But here's the part you have to understand. It's still destructive. Like, just picture this with me for a second. What if I brought just like a few tons of dirt and just laid it out on the stage right here? And then I planted a seed and I start to grow a tree. Now, if I bring in UV lights, if I water it and I fertilize it, the truth is I'm going to grow a tree. Even inside this room, if I have the right conditions, if I get the right lighting, if I get the right things. But what you don't see happening under the surface is all the dirt, the moisture, the weight of everything is deteriorating the platform that it's on. Right? Like underneath the surface, it is destroying everything. And eventually, it will give way and it will be a disaster. And so when we say, do things God's way, and you're like, well, I didn't do it God's way, and it didn't feel like the world fell apart, that wasn't the promise, that immediately things just go haywire. But at the end of it, there's still some pain that you'll end up experiencing. And the principle is this, and this goes up throughout the scriptures over and over and over. You lug what you load. Galatians 6:5 says it this way: for each one should carry their own load. And we're going to talk about this chapter more in a second. What happens, you start realizing that over time in this area of intimacy, what you start doing, you start just putting more things inside your bag. So when you're in high school and you go on spring break, and you're with that friend group and that one guy that you just like been winking at the whole time, like he finally catches your eye, and all of a sudden, next thing you know, you're adding something to your bag. Or you get to college and it's spring break again. Or it's just taco night in the dorms. I don't know. And all of a sudden, like, you're just adding a little bit more to your bag. And then, like, you graduate, and you get that real job, and you go on that conference, you got the per diem, and you're at the hotel bar that night. You start winking with the person who works at the other office on the other side of the country, and, well, you're adding it to your bag. Or it's that guy at the gym, and just such an attractive person. Or you go on that trip to Vegas. It's the romance novels, it's the pornography, and what you do is just keep adding over and over. Things are going inside the bag until next thing you know, it's a lot heavier than you remembered, and it's a lot harder to lug it around. And the principle is you lug what you load. And the passage keeps going. It says in verse 7 of Galatians chapter 6, don't be misled. You cannot mock the justice of God, that you will always harvest what you plant. Now, if you were in agriculture, you would probably understand this a little bit quicker. But let me point out the painfully obvious thing. what you plant does not grow immediately. It takes a while for it to mature. It takes a minute for you to actually see what is on the other side of the watering and the fertilizing and the sunlight. But eventually it will grow. And thank God for his patience with us. But I think sometimes we have the attitude of, well, I was expecting it to be immediate and it wasn't immediate, so it must not have been that bad. And what I'm suggesting is that I'm not talking about other people, I'm talking about us for a second. When we enter into a relationship, we have to recognize I'm carrying the luggage of my expectations, and often I'm lugging the baggage of my own regrets. Now, but there's a third thing that we often bring into these relationships as well, and that is, just frankly, we're bringing the wrong luggage. So here's the first piece of wrong luggage that we often carry. My number one goal in life should be finding the right person. But you know that more than finding the right person is being the right person. Right? Like the wrong luggage is saying, I got to keep my eyes peeled for the absolute best person to spend my life with. When we completely neglect our own character, our own integrity, the things that we bring into the relationship. Or we sometimes bring the wrong luggage of thinking, my bag is so packed. It's so full right now. I've messed up. There's absolutely no hope for me. And maybe some of you might feel like that right now. And the reality is that is a lie. Now, I know that some people are like, I just wish that somebody would have told me some of this earlier. And I get it. The Bible, it has a very high standard. And it puts a lot of emphasis on virginity. And it's like, some are like, it's too late. I've already messed up. But I want to remind us that Paul was writing to the church in Corinth that had already messed up too. And he's there to encourage them and let you know, there is hope. It doesn't have to just be your past and only your past. That God can change your future. And when you allow him to change your future, your present becomes your distant past. And in fact, let me read this. This is Hebrews 4:16. So let us come boldly to the throne of your gracious God. There we will receive his mercy and we will find grace to help us when we need it most. I've had to fly with my kids a few times on airplanes. And let me tell you, that should be an Olympic sport. There is no look like the look of disappointment when you walk onto an airplane with a small child and you see all the people terrified that you're going to sit next to them. Now, here's the thing. My kids, especially when they were little, could never carry everything that we packed for them. All the clothes, the toys, the stroller, the car seats, all that kind of stuff, they couldn't carry it. They're too little, their little chubby arms couldn't possibly carry it. And so you know what I would do? I would carry their stuff. And not only would I carry their stuff, I would carry them too. And what I'm trying to say is, a conversation like this today, it has the potential to go south really quick because, like I said, the most ideal time to hear any of this is before you've made any mistakes. But we live in a world where, frankly, probably the majority of us, we didn't hear it in time. And we think, well, it's too late. But it's not. Jesus will carry you. You are not hopeless. You're not without a great future. God can still give you an incredible relationship. He can still give you an incredible marriage. He can still pair you with the absolute right person. And the reason why is because we live on the other side of the cross. We live on the other side of an empty grave. And Jesus is promising, we bring this to him and he will carry us. He will give you the strength that you need. And let me remind you, where the Spirit of Jesus is, where the Spirit of the Lord is, there is freedom. And that was written to this church in Corinth, where it was a very common thing to say, you know what, after church today, we're going down and we're bringing our singles, I guess, and we're going to the temple. Where the Spirit of the Lord is, there is freedom. That no matter what your past has been like, God wants you to know he has an exciting future for you. And he who is set free is free indeed. You need to believe that this is true. That regardless if your expectations or your regrets, or if you've just been carrying the wrong things for years, God's saying, hand it over to me. I'll take care of it. I'll take care of it. And how much different would your future look like? How much better would your future relationships be if you approach them the right way? Maybe you are living in that statistic of, man, like I've already had one failed marriage. I've already had 2 failed marriages. I think I'm broken and I'm helpless. And God wants you to know, even for you, there is hope. We can turn this around. Even if your bag is so full and you're like, I got so many regrets, God's saying, here, hand it to me. I will take care of it, and I will take this off of your shoulders. But how shameful and how disappointing would it be to know that God's willing to take all that upon himself, and you say, no, I still think that I deserve to carry this with me. And you walk through life cumbersome and taxed because you're just unwilling to hand it over. So let me pray for us. God, we want to lean in on your grace right now. God, I want to pray for the single people in this room who are really wanting to find that significant other. That God, I'm praying that right now that they would hand over all of the baggage in their life. All the baggage that we just so naturally carry, whether it's expectations, regrets, the wrong thing. That God, that you would accept that you would carry that burden for them, that you would carry them. And God, I'm praying that they would start to become the right person who would attract the right person, that you would bring a loving, incredible, attractive Jesus follower into their life that they could spend their life with and experience the joys and the blessings of a significant other. God, I pray for those in this room who are walking through just singleness by their own making and by their own choice. And God, you give them the resolve to be content with the decision that they've made, or maybe you've called them to. God, I pray for the people within marriages right now who are feeling regret over maybe not thinking through, that God, that you would allow the freedom to take place in their life as well. That God, that they would start to become the right person and they would love their spouse the way that you love the church, that even in our imperfections, you are willing to lay down your life for us. So Lord, we trust that your grace is better than anything that we could ever conjure up on our own. God, we believe that the freedom you hand us is better than any shackles that we impose upon ourselves. And so, Lord, I pray this all in your son Jesus' name, who is our hero and the reason why we have hope. Amen.